On October the 15th and 16th, 1954, one of Canada's worst hurricanes blew in with monster winds and epic rainfall, destroying homes, roads, bridges and lives. On Thursday, October the 11th, 2018, at the annual Hurricane Hazel Heritage Talk, Cherri Hurst and Mary Lou Ashbourne, both of the Weston Historical Society, presented a fascinating talk titled Hurricane Hazel Revisited. What follows is the talk in its entirety, recorded that evening. We hope that you enjoy this informative presentation discussing and dissecting the toll of Hurricane Hazel on the residents of the area.
My name is Margot Duncan. I'm Secretary-Treasurer of Heritage York, which is the registered charity that operates Lambton House on behalf of the City of Toronto. It's a city-owned building. And we have these heritage talks every month except for the summer, and they're, as you can see, quite nicely attended. This is the 64th anniversary talk of the anniversary of Hurricane Hazel. So next year is going to be a big one, and this is 65th. Lambton House was used as an organizing center for recovery and rescue and recovery during Hurricane Hazel, so they had a tie to that event that night. But the women who are going to tell you all about it are from the Weston Historical Society. Mary Louise Ashbourne is a former president of the Weston Historical Society, and she is the vice president of Heritage York. And knows just about everything about Weston, I think. Don't you like pressure? Anyhow, I'll introduce Mary Louise, who will introduce Cherri in the evening to you. So Mary Louise Ashbourne.
Well, my job is to introduce Cherri. And this is Cherri Hurst, and she's the now president of the Weston Historical Society. She also has stick-handled the Conservation District in Weston, which is now before the Preservation Services for confirmation. So phase 2 of the Conservation District in Weston has been managed by Cherri, and she's been chairman of that. So we hope for a successful conclusion as soon as Preservation Services has enough under their belt that they can look at our submission. Anyway, I'm delighted to introduce Cherri. This is, I have to be honest, this is her show. Cherri is a tech whiz, and she has put together visuals, which I'm sure you will find very, very informative and entertaining. And we also have her, she has also prepared handouts for you, which we hope will supplement what we have to say. So, Cherri.
Okay, before we start, does everybody have two of these? No. Okay, just one?
Well, maybe you could share with a friend.
Yeah. Okay. We have extras, so you might have one. Okay. Everybody good?
Couple seats in here. There's two handouts, so make sure you've got the two each, okay? Or share.
I think you're going to have to share the one map.
There's two handouts.
Okay. You just have your right over.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Just put her key on the floor for her.
Maybe which one do you need both? Oh, are you sure? Okay. Oh, we may have to share. Oh. I think that's it. So if there is anybody who doesn't have two, can you please share with your neighbor? Okay, so on October 15th, 1954, okay, Weston and all of southern Ontario received a wake-up call in the howling winds and the torrential flooding caused by Hurricane Hazel. This presentation will not be covering all the events. There's no way we could do that in one night. It is more of an attempt to show how it affected Weston and its neighbors during and afterwards. You have been given a map, okay, and look at the map that has not the river on it, but the streets on it, okay? And that map will help you follow along where we are talking about. You'll start up in the top left-hand corner. So, just a little bit of an explanation before we get started. Basically, criticisms have been made over the years about the people not leaving their homes when they were told, or about no warnings being given by the news and the media, and also just basically the prevailing ignorance when it came to hurricanes. Now I hope this, and so Mary Louise, obviously we both hope, that this presentation will help you understand how things were that night and how basically they happened.
Now, I would just say that Humber River facts on your handout. These are all the basic information points. You don't have to read them all now, and probably better not, but it's there for your information to help with your understanding of the severity. You understand what was going to happen on that night.
Another way to understand what happened on that night basically is to understand the meteorology of the day. So the Dominion Weather Office, which DWO, which was at Malton Airport, of course that's now Pearson Airport, was the source of all things weather related. The system of hurricane hunters, weather balloons, and weather stations they improved greatly because of World War II, but there was still one major thing that they lacked. Can anybody guess what that would be?
That we have to.
Computers. Basically, without them, all the computations and calculations and all the number crunching was done by hand. Data was collected every 12 hours by groups of technicians who then plotted their observations on the very large-scale maps that were then analyzed and interpreted by a team of meteorologists. Forecasting was done, and it was done well, but it was still done with information that was 12 to 14 hours old. So this is what we have to keep in mind, that it was done well, but it was done, like I said, done with old data. There were no classification scales, no weather warnings or weather watches, and they did have special bulletins. They did have special bulletins, but there was no standard for releasing them. So they did have bulletins that they knew what they were going to say, but they didn't know when to release them, and actually there was no consensus as to what they would actually tell people. So, and also, of course, there was no explanation of what large amounts of wind and rain could do. Now, as we've got up here already, basically then you have to look at the news media of 1954. So you have to remember this is before the internet, this is before Facebook, Twitter, all of that. We don't have any of that. And so there were only 3 things that people got their information from. One was the newspapers. Another one was the radio, and of course the third one was the TV. Except a lot of people still didn't even have TVs, so they were down to 2 things. Excuse me. And on top of that, these three things all relied on the weather office to get their information. So weather radar was basically in its infancy. There were no satellite images, no weather network to explain what was going on. And there was also no opportunity to break into a broadcast and basically to warn people. I mean, everyone's seen that, weather, bad weather coming, coming across your screen. They didn't have any of that back then. Now, these 3 media took the information received and put it into their own words. I don't know if any of you have been listening to the hurricane forecasts that have been coming up these days. I know one I heard basically said, get out, your house will not survive that. Look and to no fault of the newspapers either, because no one knew any better. But basically, the best advice that the newspapers could give was to hold on to your hat. Now, there are other circumstances too. Hurricanes need warm water to survive. When they hit land, they lose strength and they peter out. Okay? Now, when they hit mountains, they lose even more. And more of their power, and usually they totally die. There had always been lots of land and lots of mountains to stop any hurricanes from coming up to Ontario. Now, because they knew that the Humber could naturally take up to 63,000 liters of water per second, it had never been necessary to build any type of flood control system. There were no emergency plans or civil defense organizations trained to handle such a situation because they've never been needed.
Now, more than a month and a half's worth of rain had fallen in the 16 days before Hazel. So that's pretty concentrated. The clay soil of the Humber Valley could not hold any more water. The creeks and rivers feeding into the Humber River were already flowing briskly.
So then, of course, Hazel came on top of what Mary Louise was just saying. And now they tracked it. They weren't able to track it at the time, but this is what they found out since. On October 5th, it was spotted in the Caribbean Sea, first as a tropical storm, then as a hurricane. And you can see that right there, okay? And then it moved over October 12th, it crossed over to Haiti and it killed over 1,000 people. Then October 13th, it turned northwest up here towards the United States coast. Now, basically, okay, the Globe and Mail on page 32 did mention that Hurricane Hazel had killed a lot of people in Haiti. So far, that's all that was mentioned up where we lived. Now, October 14th, the DWO, the Dominion Weather Office, said it would reach the east end of Lake Ontario if the Allegheny Mountains didn't stop it, just like everybody thought it would. And now, mind you, the Toronto Star did mention on page 1 that they did report things like what Hurricane Hazel had been doing by then. October 5th, right here, sorry, October 15th, somewhere between 11 and noon, it hit landfall, like it hit the North Carolina coast. So think of that, between 11 and noon. Same day, by 4:30 to 6:30, it's up just south of the Great Lakes. Think of how fast it must have been traveling. So remnants of Hurricane Hazel basically arrived at the south of Great Lakes and merged with a trough of cold air. Now when you say remnants, it's because it was dying out. Everybody knew that, it was dying out. But it hit this trough of cold air, became extratropical, what some people called extratropical. Some people even call it a second storm. They call it Hazel 2. It's not total consensus there. But then it hit a ridge of warm air coming from the east and stalled, dropping all of its moisture at once. All 3 newspapers now carry the story on page 1.
Now, on the evening of October 15th, there came the flood. And in Toronto, water was collecting in the underpasses. People coming home from work stepped off the bus into ankle-deep water. Highways began to have washouts, and creeks were forming where they'd never been before. Woodridge was the first community on the Humber to suffer loss of life. Millions of tons of water crashed down on our trailer camp. This water headed south to Weston.
Now, Fairglen Crescent, if that is number 1 on your map, if you want to know where it is. Okay, Fairglen Crescent, Maple Bush, and D Avenue. Now these were pleasant little streets that ended in the flats, which was basically a floodplain about 50 feet lower than the rest of the streets. There were about 15 houses, and they were, mostly Depression built homes, and few, if any, even had a basement. Traveling 4 times faster than it normally did, the water indiscriminately destroyed everything in its path. And that picture there is basically the same spot where that house was. Okay? Carrying all kinds of debris, the river forced houses off their foundations. Before I carry on here, watch this house, okay, in the next few pictures. So, carrying all kinds of debris, the river forced homes off their foundations, pushing them along to hit other houses still standing, or simply to fall apart, but to cause further trouble downstream. So that is now this house. Some people were still awake and had a chance to climb to the roofs or porches, possibly even to be rescued.
Jim Crawford, a 23-year-old off-duty officer, got to the river just when Herb Jones, a local contractor, was asking for help. Herb wanted to help rescue those in trouble with his 14-foot boat, and Jim agreed. That night, Herb Jones and Jim Crawford were able to bring more than 50 people to safety. Jim held a spotlight to guide Herb to the shouts for help in the darkness.
We made our way into the tumultuous waves and currents of the river. Jones soon impressed me with his expertise in the lick-lashing handling of the boat as we maneuvered between houses, picking trapper pennants from rooftops, from porches, from garage roofs. and some who had even slid down the sides of their houses on rope-type threads of sheets from bedroom windows and into the boat. We bounced about crazily like a small cork, the boat literally at times almost standing on its end as we made our way back to the shore with our precious cargo aboard. At one point, the motor broke down because the shear pin was broken. I held onto a tree to keep us from being carried downstream and aimed at the spotlight so Herb could see to make the repair. When there were no more houses because the street was gone, we went home. I guess it was worse for Herb. Herb couldn't swim.
St. Philip's Bridge.
Which is number 2 on your map. Sorry, Mary.
North end of town. Built in 1910, St. Philip's Bridge was the longest concrete arch bridge in Canada at that time. It was held in place by the abutments, which were buried deep in the steep banks on either side of the valley. When the mass of debris hit the bridge, it acted like a dam, causing the water to rise very quickly. This undermined and washed away the approach and the abutment on the Etobicoke side. The bridge itself held firm.
At nearly midnight, Constable Dick Stock of the Toronto City Police was sent with other officers to the Weston Police Station to assist rescue workers. He was told there were houses coming down the Humber River and was ordered to St. Philip's Bridge to watch for swimming victims. When he arrived at the crumpled bridge, a house was just going under.
Well, when the house hit the bridge, it simply exploded as if a bomb had hit it. As the remains of the house disappeared down the raging river, I heard a scream for help. At the broken end of the bridge, I could see a man holding onto a branch about 20 feet from the west shore. Everyone seemed to just stand there and look at him. I peeled off my tunic, gun belt and hat and eased myself into the swollen river towards the screaming man. The current was tremendous. For every 2 feet forward, I was carried 6 feet downstream. I pulled myself along a branch, and when it broke, I leaped for another branch and hung on. I really thought I was a goner. Suddenly, the man was floating past me, and I made a grab at him and missed by inches. I will never forget his face. It was then someone on shore began throwing a rope to me. After several tries, it landed across my shoulders and caught in the branch where I could grab it. I was lucky. I was pulled to safety.
Now the next place here was the Lawrence Avenue Bridge, and that's number 3 on your map. Okay? Now this bridge was built in 1940 to replace the old iron bridge. Again, the bridge held while the abutments did not. Buried under the bridge was the Weston's main telephone cable. It was severed during the storm, and as a result, many of those on the Cherri exchange in Weston were out without phone service. Now the collapse of these structures it basically cut Weston off from all the areas around.
Now, Lions Park Arena, number 4 on your map. November 25, 1949, the Weston Lions celebrated the opening of the new arena after a great deal of fundraising, including a lucky draw for a $10,000 bungalow. Just 5 years later, Hurricane Hazel swamped this new facility with 5 feet of water. The next morning, when the building was assessed for damage, mud and silt covered everything up to the high water mark, but the building remained sound.
Now number 5 on your map, south of the arena sat the tennis courts and the club rooms. There were also the lacrosse box, dressing rooms, and bleacher seats. All of these, plus 6 acres of seeded playing field, were wiped out. When the water receded, 2 motor cars, a truck, and a tanker trailer had been deposited in the center.
Well, the automobiles left behind were an example of how fast and powerful the river really was. With everyday objects turned into lethal missiles, rescue attempts were thwarted time and time again. Police, volunteer firemen, and everyday citizens would be close enough to hear and see the people in distress, but sometimes there was nothing to be done. Even when the right equipment did arrive, rescue attempts were incredibly dangerous. Members of the fire department tried using a boat with a rope tied to it. They were almost swamped when the rope extended to its maximum length.
We were within hearing distance of these awful screams from women and children leaning out windows and hanging onto rooftops, but we couldn't get close to them until we got the boats. And even then, when they came, some of them were too small. If you didn't have a 15 horsepower motor, it was no good. Until we got the boats there was nothing we could do. You couldn't drive into the torrents of water because your car would be rolled away. You had to watch the high power lines that were coming down. But mostly, all you had to do was wait for the boats.
Sometimes would-be rescuers almost turned into victims, and sometimes they really did. 5 firemen from the Lambton Kingsway area sent out to help stranded motorists were drowned when their truck was swept out from under them. Now, number 6 on your map is the Weston Sewage Plant. Okay, now it was a combined system. Basically, it took in rainwater plus the water from the homes. And the large cement tanks, as you can see there, now they wouldn't be damaged because they'd be used to being underwater with their massive skimming arms. So, but lying exposed around those tanks, right? Around those tanks was the sedimentation tanks, or the vast drying beds. The sewage and the waste would be swept down the river along with all the other debris. And to add insult to injury, the town dump was just right south of the sewage plant, and so that was all swept down too.
Now, the swing bridge, this is number 7 on the map. There had been a footbridge in this area since 1912. And ironically, over the years, the bridge had been replaced due to flooding. And we always called it the swing bridge. It didn't swing, but side to side, it swung. And as you went across, the boys would jump up and down. The bridge would really go like this. And of course, the girls would, so it was very exciting crossing this footbridge, and it was known as the swing bridge. It had just been rebuilt in 1950 to replace the condemned one that had been there since 1940.
Now, number 8 on your map is Raymore Drive. Raymore Drive was a quiet little residential street nestled on the flatlands, and sheltered by a gentle bend in the Humber River. Boasting its own beach, it curved right around the bend with Gilhaven Avenue acting as a radius. The little 1- and 2-story cottage-like houses were well taken care of and were quite comfortable, except for maybe the odd spring pesky flooding. Some people had lived there for more than 50 years without the water causing any undue concern. So when it was suggested on Friday night that the residents seek higher ground and go up to the Army-Navy Club, which was up on Kingdom Street, only a few heeded the advice. When the power failed around 10:30 p.m., most people who had TVs turned them off and went to bed. David Phillip recounts what he saw.
Houses were floating down the river and some had smashed into the swing bridge, putting it under severe strain. Debris continued to pile up against the wire ropes. Then I saw the westerly abutment of the bridge tear loose while the easterly abutment stayed firm. The wire ropes, which supported the platform of the bridge itself, also held firm, allowing the current to swing the bridge in a slight arc before it stopped in such a way that all the debris coming down the river built up against the wire ropes, still connecting the westerly and easterly abutments. The normal flow of water was stopped, and then suddenly the river was diverted in a tidal wave right across the floodplain that was Raymore Drive. The homes were literally lifted off their foundations and swept away. You could hear the people screaming, many of them standing on their roofs. In many cases, the screaming just stopped. The home just disintegrated, and that was the end of it.
Now, the next morning, Raymore Drive, this is a newspaper rendition of where the damage took place. Next morning, 1,200 feet of Raymore Drive and Gilhaven Avenue had been swept away. 14 houses were no longer there, and 36 people were gone. The street was left a sopping mess strewn with rocks, boulders, and debris.
Number 9 on your map is St. Matthias Church. It was built in 1895. and was moved to its present location on Scarlet Road in 1922. Reverend Paul Glover, deacon to St. Matthias, sent his father a telegram.
Tragedy has struck my parish. Stop. Many dead. Stop. Others lost their homes. Stop. Please pray and appeal for assistance. Stop.
About 1/3 of his congregation was lost. In the aftermath of the hurricane, over 200 volunteers probed the wreckage for bodies for up to a week after the storm. They patrolled and searched the riverbanks, sometimes with their bare hands. Boy Scouts were also sent out to help.
Now, my family lived on Joseph Street in Weston, which was just far enough from the river to be unaware of the devastation that was occurring during the night. The phone calls began early in the morning, one of which was a call to my brother Jamie, asking him to come to the river to join other members of the senior group of the Boy Scouts to help in the search for any signs of life. And it began as an adventure as they found the remains of homes and everyday household equipment and the wreckage of trees and cars, and they marveled at the damage. And then one of the boys found an arm sticking out of the mud. And the reality of the human tragedy came home. The police acted quickly, sending the boys home in a state of shock with a memory that lasts to this day.
Volunteers manned temporary phone lines to let people know the status of their loved ones. Bill Bursell from Weston operated the shortwave radio that connected the Salvation Army with the isolated areas. It was the only communication link they had with this ham radios. Everywhere, police, firefighters, and ordinary citizens were praised for coming together and working tirelessly to help out. At St. Matthias, neighboring housewives and others in the area that had not been struck by the tragedy worked in shifts all day, Saturday and Sunday, supplying coffee and sandwiches for those doing the searching for the bodies. Meals, clothing, and temporary housing were arranged for those whose homes had been swept away. According to one volunteer, donated clothing and blankets were piled on the pews until the pile reached almost to the ceiling, were distributed, and then more came in to replace them. Clothing was accepted at 4 centers in Weston: the Fire Hall, the Legion Hall, the Town Hall, and the Salvation Army. And then they were immediately taken to areas where it was needed. The Weston Town Hall was used as a registration office for survivors, a depot for donated items, and a depository for donations for the Ontario Hurricane Relief Fund. Everyone, from parishioners to businessmen to junior class members, donated money. Lists of who gave what were pages long in the local newspaper. If you read the headline, there was I'm not quite sure about the logic of that, but there was a turkey shoot in order to raise money. But there's also one cleaner offered to clean anything that had been damaged in the storm, and you can see he ended up with over 5,000 orders. And he said he would do it for free, too.
It was a time to mourn. Weston people, mindful of their loss, paused in the daily business and bareheaded lined the funeral route when the 9 of the flood victims were taken from Ward Funeral Home to various churches and then moved slowly to the cemeteries.
Now, cleaning and rebuilding. On October 22nd, the Army was sent into the Humber Valley with bulldozers and flamethrowers to burn up the mess, as 800 militia soldiers still searched for 16 missing persons. Rebuilding started almost immediately, with the Lawrence Avenue Bridge being temporarily opened on October 25th. And then St. Philip's would be open too, but it had a very large crack in it, but they still deemed it safe, so they opened it. Traffic in Weston was an absolute mess because due to the other bridges around that had not been fixed yet. So Weston was fixing their bridges, and of course everybody started to use those because the other ones were out. Salvage and repair work on the arena started immediately too. Within 2 days, the building had been thoroughly cleaned and the electrical equipment was in the process of being overhauled. A week after the flood, the arena was in full operation.
Now, my father, Carl Caskey, was a member of the Weston Lions Club, and he was a member of the Weston Arena Board. When the water receded and the arena was accessible, The records of the board meetings and the financial accounts were found to be water damaged. Ever practical, and to prevent the loss of the records, my father brought them home, where he spread out newspapers over the living room floor and carefully separated the damp and not too clean pages, setting them out in rows to dry on top of the newspapers. My mother held her nose, and in my recollection, she never said a word. The records were saved, and I think my mother deserved the medal.
Now, the tennis courts and playing field were in danger of not being rebuilt due to the cost, but with donations amounting to $2,200, which back in 1954 would probably be close to, probably be close to $10,000 now. With the raising of $2,200, the bulldozing, leveling, seeding, and fertilizing began. Hurricane Hazel caused a huge housing shortage all across Toronto, with as many as 4,000 homes destroyed or possibly damaged. Now, if you look at, now we're talking about Hurricane Hazel by the numbers, which if you look at your map there again, it does talk some more numbers. And if you remember what I said earlier, the Humber Valley, they knew the Humber Valley could take 63,000 liters of water per second. Well, Hazel dropped almost 5 million. So that basically would have been 78 times more than what it could handle.
So what is Hazel's legacy? In the year 2000, the Plains magazine ranked Hurricane Hazel as one of the top 50 nation-building events of the 20th century. St. Matthias was designated under the Ontario Heritage Act in 2003 with specific reference to the significant contribution of the church and parishioners during Hurricane Hazel in the days immediately following. Hurricane Hazel changed the thinking about conservation in South Central Ontario. People realized that trees absorb water, while pavement does not.
Hazel brought a regional approach to flood control and water management in Ontario. In 1957, 4 existing conservation authorities amalgamated into the Toronto and Region Conservation Authority. Its mandate was watershed management and sustainability practices. 4 dams were built on the Humber as a part of a flood control system. A flood forecasting and warning system which monitors watershed conditions was instigated. 326 square miles of parkland were created over the Toronto area, putting a stop to development on the floodplain. Please note the name of the one park, Crawford and Jones, the 2 guys that went out and saved roughly 50 people.
Where is that?
That's up near Fair Glen and D Avenue and stuff.
At the north end.
On that, I can show you on the map later if you like. This was also, the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale was developed and even shows the damage to expect. Remember I said at the beginning, they didn't know what to expect, and now they do. They have it all monitored. With the advent of computers and technology, meteorology has established standards for weather bulletins, watches, warnings, and advisories. All have enough lead time now and the ability to warn people far in advance. And then in 1971, Environment Canada was created, and it has since retired the name of Hazel. That's it. Any questions?
Is it thought that the hurricane followed a unique path through the mountains?
Is it thought that it followed a unique path? It followed, just the fact that it went over the mountains was very unique.
Like it had never previously occurred, had it?
No.
I have 2 questions. One is, if it came from the south, the Caribbean, how come Woodbridge was hit north and then it came down the Humber River?
Because if you look at your map of the river, it's in a funnel shape. So you gotta remember, all the rain fell at once, okay? So you got all that water running down to Lake Ontario. And so the first thing that actually was hit was a dam, or the first thing that let go was a dam in Bolton. And then all that water rushed down to Woodbridge, and that was the first place where somebody died. Okay,
so
and then
wasn't the tracking of the hurricane?
No, the hurricane came, stopped, dropped all the water, and so that's when all this, I mean, that is a huge watershed that Humber,
So my second question is, if afterwards the TRCA or whatever, Conservation Authority had said no development in that, all along the Humber River, the floodplain, how come to the south of here, if you follow the path, like the bike path, the downriver, there's a bunch of houses that seem, 3 or 4 meters above where the river is, and it seems they're fairly new builds.
Mary Louise and I actually were just talking about that, and the only thing we can come up with is that people have short memories.
How are they allowed to build?
I've done some research. What happened was, after Hurricane Hazel, there was a clear line on shore where the water had risen to. The MTRCA was the Metropolitan Toronto Region Conservation Authority at that time. It became the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. They said, this is the floodplain line. So wherever the water had risen to before, that's the floodplain. We're going to buy out anybody who has property there, and that's what they did. So these new houses must be above the line that the water rose from.
Do we know that? Just assuming.
No, I know. I've researched it.
The line was actually below the house.
Yes.
And there was one other thing, when the old mill it was a ruin at the time, but they wanted to rebuild the old mill, which of course is in the floodplain land. And the ruling was the footprint was allowed to stand. They had to make provision for water to escape the lower level, but they were allowed to build on the grounds that it had been there before and there was a footprint, and as long as they adhered to the footprint, they could build. It wasn't a rebuild, it was a build, because it had been a ruin before.
I think one of the things that came to my mind and learning about Hurricane Hazel was, I think about 5 years ago, we had Dave Phillips. He's from Environment Canada, the one who's always on TV. And he said the Humber River coming down here had waves 30 feet high down through here. And if that gives you an idea of what was happening at this end of it, 30 feet is just unbelievable.
It's a long way up.
Yeah,
There's huge trees, like in the valley.
You can see the mark.
Those were all underwater.
Yeah, 30 feet high.
And also, the other thing too, like I said in the notes, it's not only shaped like a funnel, it also, there's places where there's floodplains, so it can be quite wide, but there's other places, especially in Weston, where it's quite narrow.
Yes.
And the sides are very steep. And that basically, so of course you're not only squishing it into this funnel, you're squishing it into this little tiny skinny area too. Sorry? Yeah, like when you think of it, you got houses coming down the river. I mean, we're not talking twigs and leaves and stuff. We're talking houses, trees, cows, anything within it. Yes.
In one of your first pictures, the first or second picture, there was a railway bridge. What's the railway bridge?
I think one of the first pictures with a bridge would be Woodbridge.
No, the bridge would be the railroad, our railroad, which
Is that the one just north of
the
here?
Grand Trunk Railway.
And the first, I think the second or third picture.
Grand Trunk.
Oh, would it be okay. And what?
I'm just wondering where exactly is that railway bridge, and is it still standing?
Yes, it is still standing, it's
Yes.
immediately north.
That's the trestle at Weston, Golf and Country?
Yes, that's right, that's right.
Right above St. Philip's.
It's still standing. It was built in 1856, and it survived Hurricane Hazel and is still standing and still being used.
You can see the watermark, how high it was there.
I don't see the bridge. I don't think I had a picture of this. The first, there's the first bridge, but that's Woodbridge.
Is that what we?
Yeah, that's.
Well, that's not the.
No, it's not a railroad bridge either, yeah. The other, I mean, it went by the train trestle that we were talking about. But with it, it was on piers and still is, and so it basically went around, or went through and survived.
What happened to that wonderful stone bridge down by the old mill that was built in 1916? Was that just...
That I'm not sure.
Oh, it was damaged, but it's still there, it was rebuilt.
It was rebuilt.
The approaches were washed out, but the bridge itself stood.
The bridge stood, the new approaches.
I think down in the corner down there was a question.
What's there? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, that was my question. What happened to the old mill bridge and then the bridge across Bloor Street? Were they pushed out?
The bridge across
Bloor Street
was damaged.
Was the only one that was not condemned.
Yeah.
The engineers cut track of it, and it was safe. They used it for landing helicopters for search and rescue.
When when you think that crossing the Humber it's major, and so many of the bridges, the abutments were gone, so it just literally cut that part of the city off from the rest. Etobicoke on this side and the rest of the city on this side.
Yeah,
And within days.
yeah.
The railroad bridges were the only ones that survived properly, and Bloor Street Bridge, because it was the Bloor Highway, and the Dundas Bridge was slightly damaged, but it was reusable quite quickly.
They had just built the new bridge on Highway 401, which had to be torn down and rebuilt as a result of the hurricane.
I just wanted to point, I wasn't sure if people had noticed this when, I think it was John was saying that people actually used sheets to climb out of the window, and that was there.
Hazel also hit the Holland Marsh, right?
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah.
Where did it join in at all with the Humber watershed to put more pressure coming down here? Because it was shooting straight across, right? Houses were going straight across.
I'm not sure myself.
If I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, the Humber Holland Marsh is north of the moraine.
Yes.
The Humber River has its headwaters rise in the moraine.
Right.
We're south of the moraine.
Right.
The Holland Marsh is north of the moraine.
Right.
So it's a different.
But did it
watershed.
flow because it was such a huge amount
It
of water?
flows into Lake Simcoe, and it's
So it
flooded.
flew east and north rather than south and west? Ah, okay.
But it followed the natural curve of the earth,
Right.
of the ground towards
Yeah.
Lake Simcoe.
Okay.
It's the Nottawasaga. It's not
I'm not sure.
watershed, it's the Nottawasaga watershed up there.
Yeah.
And so it goes, the bridge is Highway 9, I think.
Right, yeah, it is at Highway 9, yeah, but I didn't realize that it flowed east and north. Okay.
Holland River.
The Holland River?
Yeah.
And but north end up there.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
Okay, I'm just gonna turn around so everybody can hear me. I remember Hurricane Hazel. I was 2.5 years old. It's one of my earliest memories. And we lived in North York, and my mother was concerned if my father was coming home that Friday night. There was water all over the road, and you couldn't see where the driveways were. But my dad drove the car along the road, and he saw the garbage can there because it was garbage day, and he knew from where the garbage can was, he knew where to turn in. So a couple of weeks later, we went to see some of the damage caused by Hurricane Hazel, and I think we went to the Weston area, and I didn't hear any reference to this, but the Army had been there and they had put up a Bailey Bridge. And the Bailey Bridge has great big timbers that are across the road, and you go over it and in the car. And the Army engineers had called this bridge Sag and Susie. So when I was a kid, I thought any bridge that you could feel vibration, that's a Sag and Susie bridge. So, but I don't know where this Bailey Bridge was.
I don't think it was in Weston, because I've heard the story of them putting up a Bailey Bridge, but I could not find it anywhere in any of the newspapers or anything. But it was very close by. It might have been even north. I'm not sure. Yeah.
Can you recap the timeline for, like, it's raining on Friday night, is it? And then it builds up a mass of water and there's a big flood down the river. How long did that major wash of water occur for? Was it half an hour, 4 hours?
That's,
We went down the next morning to see the river, and the river was up to the top of the bridge still, at that point down at the Lawrence Avenue Bridge. Now, there's quite a drop. If you go over the Lawrence Avenue Bridge today and see where the actual level of the water, there's, I would say 20 feet. It was up to the banks.
So it was at high flood for over 12 hours?
Oh, more than 12 hours, because the rains began, it had rained for 7 days before, so the ground was soaked. Then in that period, there came that much water over the whole watershed. And then it all had to drain down this funnel. And it came to Weston, and we were the stem of the funnel. And so that's why they said with the water rising 30 feet at least as it came down through Weston, it was tremendous force and it wiped out so much. But in the time, by noon the next day, it was receding because the rains had stopped. And as it's like the bathtub. As you pull the plug, it takes a while, and eventually it just recedes. So by noon the next day, the water was definitely receding.
and the rain had actually stopped.
And the rain had stopped.
By midnight.
Yeah.
Was it? Was there sunshine the next morning? Oh, no.
Yeah. Clear air, it was nice to go out all day, and it was just beautiful.
Oh my gosh. Anyways,
And I looked at the river.
and that was part of it, was that it was, you know, that, like Mary Louise said, you know, people were stepping off the buses on the way home from work, so you're talking 4:30, 5 o'clock, you know, anytime.
It was raining.
And it was still kind of traversable, you know, the buses were still running and stuff, but by 11 o'clock midnight, it's all over. And yet, you know, you got all those houses and all those people gone.
Heritage York, several years ago, did a DVD, so you can tell how old it was. And we now did interviews with some of the firefighters who were on the truck where the firefighters lost their lives.
I listened to it while I was doing this. Yeah.
Yes, and with other people who were part of the rescue recovery. I think part of that DVD said that they put nets across the mouth of the Humber to catch bodies, to try and find people. We probably, for next year, for the 65th, will reproduce that in whatever modern medium they use now, because I don't think anybody can use a DVD. But it's a really interesting bit of history because it's the people who were actually there that night. And we also managed to bring in some of the CBC radio coverage of it. So it's a very nice one. So if you're interested next year, I think the Heritage York will be looking at reproducing something along that line so you can see the history from those people who did it.
There's so much more to the story, but I definitely, I concentrated on Weston. I mean, that's what it was meant for originally, but, you know, it's just, and I wanted to let people understand, because there has been so many criticisms of people not leaving their home and they didn't hear from the news, but people, you know, and the news did, they put warnings out, but of course, you know, people didn't listen to the radio as much as they used to, or even the TV, then maybe they didn't have it. So there are so many circumstances, kind of reminds me of the Titanic, so many circumstances, but then afterwards, I also wanted to make people realize that people came together and they helped, and there wasn't a criticism anywhere of the police, of the firemen, anyone, and even then I had it in one of the news articles that at least the premier, if not the prime minister, sent a letter congratulating everybody on what they did.
I just have a comment. The weather was forecast correctly, but nobody could make the correlation at that time between the weather and the amount of flooding.
Exactly. Yeah.
And one of the reasons why a lot of the people stayed in their home is that people would be saying, "Oh, I've lived on this river for 50 years, and I've never seen anything that we can't handle. I'm not gonna evacuate." And they were telling the younger people, "Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it." But this was a once in 100-year storm. Nobody had ever seen it before.
No, I would like to say, could it happen again? We learned enough. I'm not entirely sure. We have paved over and built over an enormous portion of this Humber River watershed. And if such an occurrence came, We may have early warnings, but the fact remains, where would you go? Has anybody thought of where they would head off? Now, they've had problems down in the States because they've had terrible disasters recently. But one of the problems, if you try to leave, you have a limited number of places that you can go, and even getting out of the city. You can't get out at rush hour. How could you get out in times of a desperate situation such as a hurricane coming? So you have to think through these things. As we build more and as we pave more, the ground can absorb less. And this is one of the things that they learned. Not only do you need a warning system and wetlands, but you also need just general places to absorb water. Now they try to get you to take out disconnect your downspouts. That's so the water will go into your garden and into your yard and be absorbed there. But as the more we pave, the more we build, the less our resources to fight such a thing if it should happen, if it's happened once. And it certainly has been happening down in the States. We may very well be faced with this again.
Yeah. Was this the first major natural disaster since Toronto was inhabited by us colonialists?
First, I don't know if it was the first, but it was one of the biggest at the time. Like McLean said, it was one of the top 20 natural disasters, or not natural disasters, how to nation building. Yeah, nation building events. And it's
so Toronto had really never seen anything like
definitely
that
Toronto's never seen anything.
We had floods on the Humber. There had been floods in the early years.
In fact, the Humber flooded forever.
Right.
Yeah, but nothing to this extent, right? I mean, Weston's history is... Sorry?
Weston moved across the river.
Yeah, after the major flood of 1850, yeah.
Okay, so there was one.
Yes, and the bridges, the bridges were fairly flimsy and they went out regularly when they were flooding. And a lot of the mills were a bit flimsy. They went out with flooding or fire. So, these people took this in stride somehow. I think it's very difficult, but the fact remains they had coped with things. And of course, massive fires in the city of Toronto, we had to get
It wasn't built up now.
Yeah,
that's true.
Yes, well, just this summer, there was the flooding on Black Creek, which is a tributary of the Humber, and those two people were trapped in the elevator. The water rose 3.2 meters in less than an hour, and the Conservation Authority's monitoring of the water rises in Black Creek and the Humber was not adequate. The upriver monitoring devices that they needed were not in place, and Toronto had not agreed to pay for them. The Conservation Authority is installing them now at Conservation Authority expense, and they'll come to in the vicinity of $100,000 to monitor.
Let's say, like, now our weather's even worse, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Okay, thanks very much for coming.
Thank you.